The snow fell in thick curtains across the East Prussian forests on that bitter January evening in 1943, and inside the concrete bunker of the Wolfschanz, the Wolf's Lair, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus's final radio transmission from Stalingrad had just crackled through the speakers like a death rattle for the entire German war machine. General der Infanterie Kurt Zeitzler stood frozen at the map table, his face drained of color as he watched Hitler's hands tremble over the tactical markers representing the Sixth Army. Nearly 300,000 men who had marched into Russia with songs on their lips and were now either dead, dying, or shuffling into Soviet captivity through streets they'd once conquered. In that moment, as the Führer's voice rose to a hysterical pitch, screaming about willpower and destiny while reality burned around them like the ruins of Stalingrad itself, Zeitzler felt something crack inside his chest. Not his heart, but something harder and more fundamental, the architectural certainty that had held up his entire worldview. He realized with the cold clarity of a man watching his own execution that they had already lost this war, that perhaps they had lost it the moment the 1st Panzer crossed into the Soviet Union, or maybe even before that, lost it in the arithmetic of American industrial capacity and the vast distances of Russia and the simple, terrible mathematics of trying to conquer the world with insufficient resources and unlimited hubris. But the most horrifying part, the thought that would haunt him through sleepless nights as the war ground on for 2 more years of pointless slaughter, was that he couldn't say this, couldn't act on this knowledge, couldn't stop the machine from devouring another million German boys because the man across the table, who now shouted about Götterdämmerung and refused to allow retreat even when retreat was the only sane option, had long ago ceased to inhabit the same reality as the rest of them, had retreated into a fortress of delusion more impregnable than any Atlantic wall. The realization didn't come all at once for most of them, though for some it struck like lightning. For General Feld Marshal Erwin Rommel, the desert fox who danced across North Africa like a predator playing with prey, the moment arrived not in the heat of battle, but in the cold accounting of logistics. Sitting in his command vehicle somewhere between Tobruk and defeat, he'd calculated fuel consumption rates, ammunition expenditures, the replacement schedules for tanks and men, and he'd seen the equation that wouldn't balance. The British could lose 10 tanks for every one of his and still win because they had America's factories behind them, an ocean away from bombs, churning out Shermans and Grants like a baker making bread. He'd written to his wife Lucy in carefully coded language about certain difficulties in the overall situation. But what he meant was that he was trying to fight a modern war with a peacetime economy that had somehow convinced itself that willpower could substitute for steel. By the time he stood on the beaches of Normandy in 1944, watching the greatest armada in human history blacken the horizon, he knew they were fighting for nothing but the privilege of choosing how they would lose, and he'd already decided that prolonging German suffering for Hitler's apocalyptic fantasies was a crime he could no longer participate in, which was why he'd listen when the conspirators came calling, why he'd die with poison in his mouth rather than face the People's Court's mockery. General der Panzertruppen Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg itself, the man who'd proven that tanks weren't just mobile artillery but the cavalry of a new age, felt the foundation crack beneath him during the winter of 1941, when his 19th Panzer Corps ground to a halt just miles from Moscow, so close he could see the spires of the Kremlin through his binoculars on clear days. His tanks, those magnificent machines that had torn through France in 6 weeks, were freezing solid in temperatures that dropped to 40 below zero. The oil in their engines turned to sludge, the rubber on their treads cracked like old leather, and his men were dying of frostbite because someone in Berlin had been so confident of victory before winter that they hadn't bothered to send cold weather gear. Meanwhile, the Soviets kept coming, waves of them, T-34s that were crude and ugly compared to his beautiful panzers but worked in the cold, driven by men who knew how to fight in winter because winter was what they knew. Guderian had studied military history. He knew what happened to armies that invaded Russia. Napoleon had learned this lesson and Charles XII of Sweden before him, but somehow Hitler thought he was different, that the laws of logistics and weather and human endurance didn't apply to him because he had willpower and destiny on his side. Standing in the frozen mud, watching another regiment get cut to pieces by Siberian divisions that weren't supposed to exist, Guderian understood that they'd walked into the same trap that had killed every other conqueror foolish enough to try, except this time they'd done it while also fighting Britain and soon, inevitably, America too. For General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel and General Oberst Alfred Jodl, the yes-men who ran the OKW Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, and spent their days translating Hitler's fantasies into operational orders, the knowledge came differently because they trained themselves not to know things that contradicted the Führer's vision. They'd perfected the art of hearing without listening, of presenting information in ways that confirmed rather than challenged, of finding technical justifications for strategic insanity. But even they couldn't entirely ignore reality when it came wearing an American uniform. The intelligence reports from 1942 onward painted a picture so stark that even a true believer had to feel a tremor of doubt. America was producing more aircraft in a month than Germany could in a year, more ships in a week than the Kriegsmarine possessed in total, training more men, refining more fuel, building more of everything at a scale that made European warfare look like a Renaissance skirmish. Keitel would sit in conference rooms, nodding along as Hitler dismissed these figures as Jewish lies or democratic weakness. But at night, alone with the reports, he must have done the math. You can't beat arithmetic with ideology. You can't outproduce a continent that's untouched by war and has 10 times your industrial capacity. But Keitel was a coward, more afraid of Hitler's rage than of losing the war. So he kept nodding, kept signing orders, kept feeding men into the meat grinder until the very end. And when the Americans hanged him at Nuremberg, his last words were an apology to Hitler, not to Germany or the men he'd helped destroy. General Oberst Franz Halder, who served as chief of the Army General Staff until Hitler fired him in 1942 for the crime of telling uncomfortable truths, had seen it coming from the beginning. A meticulous planner who believed in the Prussian tradition of careful preparation and realistic assessment, Halder had watched in growing horror as Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa with oil reserves sufficient for only a few months of combat, assuming they'd capture Soviet oil fields before running dry. It was a plan that required everything to go perfectly, and Halder had been in the army long enough to know that nothing ever goes perfectly. He tried to explain this in his careful, staff officer way, presenting contingencies and alternative scenarios, but Hitler didn't want contingencies. He wanted certainty, even if it was false certainty. By the time the Wehrmacht was bleeding out in the streets of Stalingrad, fighting for a city that had no strategic value beyond its name, Halder had already resigned himself to defeat. He kept a diary, coded and hidden, where he recorded his real thoughts, and those pages are full of a bitter, helpless anger at watching professional soldiers be overruled by an amateur who thought intuition trumped logistics. He'd been part of the early resistance discussions, the secret meetings where officers whispered about arresting Hitler or staging a coup, but nothing came of them because too many generals had convinced themselves that winning was still possible, or at least that losing while following orders was more honorable than winning through betrayal. The junior officers saw it too, perhaps more clearly than their superiors because they were closer to the actual fighting and further from the intoxication of power. Hauptmann Helmut Schmidt, who would later become Chancellor of West Germany, spent the war bouncing between the Eastern and Western fronts, and he remembered the moment on the Oder River in 1945 when his commanding officer, drunk on schnapps and despair, told him they were just buying time now, that Berlin was already lost, that they were sacrificing themselves so that more civilians could escape westward to surrender to the Americans instead of the Russians. What do you do with knowledge like that? How do you order men to die for a delay tactic, for a lost cause, for nothing? Schmidt survived by luck and by being smart enough to understand the difference between courage and suicide, but thousands of others died in those last months, crushed between the Soviet hammer and the hard place of Hitler's refusal to acknowledge reality. They died defending positions that had no value, launching counterattacks that had no hope of success, all because the chain of command ran through a bunker in Berlin where a madman was moving imaginary divisions on a map. The Luftwaffe's descent was particularly visible and particularly painful for those who'd believed in Hermann Göring's promises of air supremacy. General Oberst Hans Gestenek, the Luftwaffe's chief of staff, killed himself in August 1943 after the Hamburg firestorm, when Allied bombers burned an entire city and killed 40,000 people in a single night, and the vaunted German Air Force could barely muster a response. He'd spent years watching the Luftwaffe's strength drain away in Russia and the Mediterranean while Hitler diverted resources to wonder weapons and prestige projects instead of building the fighters they desperately needed. By 1944, young pilots with barely 50 hours of training were being thrown against American bomber streams protected by long-range fighters and flying back into a Germany that was running out of fuel, out of spare parts, out of everything except targets for Allied bombs. The aces who survived, men like Adolf Galland with over 100 kills, knew they were participating in a slow-motion suicide. Galland argued for jet fighters, for rational defense strategies, for anything that might give them a mathematical chance, But Göring was too busy looting art and Hitler was too busy demanding revenge weapons instead of defensive ones. The moment of realization for the fighter pilots came when they stopped seeing individual bombers and started seeing formations so large they blocked out the sun, knowing that even if they shot down 10 or 20, hundreds more would get through, and tomorrow there would be more, always more, an inexhaustible stream of them. At sea, Grossadmiral Karl Donitz had built the U-boat fleet into a weapon that nearly strangled Britain, and he understood submarine warfare better than anyone alive, which is why he knew exactly when they'd lost the Battle of the Atlantic. It was May 1943, Black May they called it, when the Allies sank 41 U-boats in a single month. The mathematics were brutal. He was losing boats faster than they could be built, losing crews faster than they could be trained, and the Allies were building escort carriers and long-range patrol aircraft that closed the air gap in the mid-Atlantic where U-boats had once hunted safely. Donitz kept sending boats out because Hitler demanded it and because he was a true believer in the Nazi cause, but he knew each one had less chance of returning than the last. The technological war had turned against them. Allied radar could spot a surface submarine in the dark, depth charges had gotten smarter, and the codebreakers at Bletchley Park were reading his orders almost as fast as his own commanders. By 1944, U-boat service had become a death sentence, but still the boats went out, still the crews obeyed, because that's what training and discipline and ideology do. They keep men fighting even when the cause is hopeless. The truly tragic figures were the professional soldiers who'd spent their lives studying warfare, men like General Marshal Erich von Manstein, perhaps the most brilliant tactical mind Germany produced. Manstein understood operational art at a level that impressed even his enemies. His counterattack at Kharkov in 1943 was a masterpiece of mobile warfare, destroying 3 Soviet armies and stabilizing a front that had been on the verge of collapse. But tactical brilliance can't overcome strategic stupidity, and the strategic situation was hopeless. Manstein knew this, presented plans for elastic defense and strategic withdrawal, argued for trading space for time, for preserving the army as a political bargaining chip for some kind of rational endgame. Hitler called this defeatism and fired him. The tragedy of Manstein was that he was competent enough to see the disaster coming but not courageous enough to actively resist it, so he kept fighting, kept winning small victories that meant nothing, kept sacrificing divisions in a game where the only prize was choosing which foreign army got to occupy your country. He'd tell himself he was doing his duty, serving Germany rather than Hitler, but the effect was the same. Prolonging a war that was killing his countrymen for no purpose except Hitler's delusions. The intelligence services knew, of course. They'd known from the beginning because knowing things was their job. And unlike the generals, they didn't have the comfort of denying uncomfortable facts. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, had been collecting information showing that Germany couldn't win a long war since before it even started. He'd seen the production figures, the resource assessments, the analyses of American industrial potential. He'd also seen what was happening in the occupied territories, the Einsatzgruppen reports, the bureaucratic language that described genocide in passive voice and euphemism. Canaris was a complicated man. A conservative nationalist who hated what Nazism was doing to Germany but couldn't quite bring himself to fully betray his country. He fed information to the resistance, slow-walked investigations, tried to protect some of Hitler's enemies, but he didn't act decisively until it was too late. He ended up hanging from a piano wire in Flossenburg concentration camp in April 1945, killed on Hitler's orders just weeks before the war ended, dying not for what he'd done but for what he'd failed to prevent. The Eastern Front was where reality hit hardest and earliest because the Soviets didn't fight by Western European rules. They traded space for time, people for strategic advantage, accepted casualties that would have broken any Western army. German generals who'd studied at the Kriegsakademie and learned the principles of Clausewitz found themselves in a war that didn't follow the principles, fighting an enemy that didn't collapse when you cut off its head because it didn't have a single head, just a hydra of determination and resources and depth. General Feldmarschall Fedor von Bock, who commanded Army Group Center during the drive on Moscow, watched his forces gain ground every day while somehow getting weaker, watched the Russians retreat and then suddenly counterattack from directions that weren't supposed to have any reserves. He'd calculated that they'd destroyed more Soviet divisions than intelligence said existed, but somehow there were always more, and his own divisions were getting thinner, more stretched, more exhausted. The moment of realization came differently for each commander, but it always came. The understanding that this enemy couldn't be beaten by the methods they knew, that the war had become a contest of attrition they were mathematically certain to lose. Back in Berlin, the armaments minister Albert Speer was watching the economy collapse in slow motion while somehow keeping it running through organizational genius and slave labor. Speer was a technocrat, interested in problems and solutions, and by 1944 the problems were overwhelming the solutions. Allied bombing wasn't destroying German production. Speer was actually increasing output through dispersal and rationalization, but it was destroying something more fundamental, the transportation network. You could build all the tanks you wanted, but they were useless if you couldn't move them to the front because the railways were cratered and the bridges were rubble. Same with fuel, ammunition, food, everything an army needed. Speer knew this, presented the data to Hitler in his careful architect's way, but Hitler didn't want to hear about logistics. He wanted to hear about miracle weapons and wonder projects. So Speer kept the machine running, kept the factories producing, even started using slave labor from the concentration camps in a desperate attempt to maintain output, a moral compromise he'd spend the rest of his life trying to rationalize. He knew the war was lost by the summer of 1944, wrote memos saying so, but he couldn't bring himself to sabotage production, couldn't quite commit to resistance, so he just kept doing his job while Germany burned. The younger generation of generals, men who'd risen through merit rather than aristocratic privilege, men like Generalleutnant Walther Wenck, who became the youngest general in the Wehrmacht at age 42, saw things with less ideological blinders. Wenck had commanded panzer divisions in Russia, understood mobile warfare, and by 1945 was commanding the 12th Army in what everyone knew was a hopeless attempt to relieve Berlin. He carried out his orders, but he also used his initiative to create corridors for civilians to escape westward, to avoid pointless battles, to save lives when saving the regime was no longer possible. These younger commanders had grown up with the Nazi system but hadn't entirely internalized its insanity, could still see that dead soldiers served no purpose beyond satisfying Hitler's apocalyptic fantasies. They were the ones who, in the final weeks, started ignoring orders, arranging local surrenders, trying to end the war on their sector even if they couldn't end it everywhere. The conspirators of the July 20, 1944, bomb plot represent the moment when knowledge turned to action for some officers, when the realization that the war was lost combined with the understanding of what the Nazis had done in the occupied territories to create a moral imperative for treason. Oberst Klaus von Stauffenberg, who'd lost an eye and a hand fighting in Africa, who'd seen the Einsatzgruppen reports from the East, decided that killing Hitler was worth dying for even if it wouldn't save Germany from defeat. The plot failed because of bad luck and worse planning, because too many people knew about it, because the conspirators couldn't quite commit to the ruthlessness necessary for a successful coup. The savage reprisals that followed showed what happened to German officers who acted on their knowledge that the war was lost. They got strangled slowly with piano wire, hanged with thin cord that took minutes to kill, filmed for Hitler's entertainment. Feldmarschall Erwin von Witzleben, who was to have led the post-coup government, had to hold up his pants during his trial at the People's Court because they'd taken his belt, and Roland Freisler, the hanging judge, screamed at him for being a traitor while he stood there, an old soldier being humiliated for trying to save his country. Hundreds were executed in the aftermath, and thousands more disappeared into camps. The army's last serious attempt to reclaim sanity crushed by terror. The final months of the war were a nightmare of pointless sacrifice, of armies that existed on paper being thrown into battles they couldn't win against enemies who were already dividing up the corpse of the Reich. In the Ardennes in December 1944, Hitler launched one last offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge, throwing his last reserves at the Americans in winter conditions through terrain that wasn't suited for armor, all based on a fantasy that splitting the Allied armies would force a negotiated peace. The generals who had to plan this offensive, men like von Rundstedt and Model, knew it was madness, told Hitler so, and were overruled. They attacked anyway because that's what soldiers do, and they achieved tactical surprise and some initial success before running out of fuel and getting hammered by Allied air power once the weather cleared. Thousands of irreplaceable soldiers died for nothing. Panzers that could have defended Germany got burned out in Belgian forests, and the only result was to delay the inevitable by a few weeks. The defense of Berlin in April 1945 was the ultimate expression of this knowing futility. The officers directing it, Generals Weidling and Monk and the others, knew they were defending ruins with children and old men against armies that outnumbered them 10-1. They knew Hitler was in his bunker raving about rescue offensives from armies that no longer existed, knew that every day they held out just meant more Germans died for absolutely nothing. But they held anyway, fought block by block, sometimes room by room, because discipline and training and fear kept them going even after reason had departed. In his bunker, Hitler was moving divisions on maps that represented nothing, issuing orders to commanders who were dead or captured, blaming everyone but himself for the disaster his megalomania had created. Above ground, the generals were watching their men die, knowing it was pointless, knowing Berlin would fall whether they fought or not, but unable to stop the machine or to imagine disobeying even when obedience had become a crime against their own people. The surrender, when it finally came, was almost an anticlimax. Grossadmiral Dönitz, who Hitler appointed as his successor in his final testament, had to negotiate Germany's capitulation with the Allies, had to order German forces to lay down their arms and accept occupation. Some units obeyed immediately, relieved to have survived. Others fought on for days, either not getting the word or refusing to believe it or hoping to surrender to the Western Allies instead of the Soviets. General Feldmarschall Schorner, commanding Army Group Center, tried to keep fighting even after the official surrender, was declared a traitor by the new government, and ended up hiding in the mountains before being captured. The professional officers, the ones who'd known it was lost for years, were almost grateful that it was over, that they could finally stop sacrificing men for a cause that had been dead long before the fighting ended. In the post-war interrogations and tribunals, many of these generals would claim they'd just been following orders, doing their duty, serving Germany rather than Hitler. Some of this was self-serving, the excuses of men trying to avoid hanging, but some of it was genuine confusion about where duty lay when your commander-in-chief was leading the nation to destruction. The tragedy of the German generals wasn't that they failed to win. The war was probably unwinnable from the start given Germany's strategic position, but that they failed to stop it when they knew it was lost. Professional soldiers are trained to obey, to see discipline as the highest virtue, and that training meant they kept the war going long past the point when anyone rational would have ended it. They told themselves they were serving Germany, but they were really serving Hitler's death wish, helping him drag their country down into a Götterdämmerung that killed millions unnecessarily. The bitter lesson they learned, the one that should have been obvious from the start, was that military professionalism and technical competence mean nothing if you're serving strategic madness. You can be the most brilliant tactician in the world, but if your strategy is to fight simultaneous wars against the three largest empires on Earth while systematically murdering millions of civilians and declaring yourself a master race, you're going to lose, and all your tactical genius will accomplish is to make the losing more prolonged and painful. The German generals of World War II were educated men, professionals who'd spent their lives studying their craft, but they'd subordinated their judgment to a former corporal who thought willpower could overcome mathematics, and they'd continued serving him even after they knew he was leading them to ruin. Their realization that they'd lost came at different times for different men, for some in Russia in 1941, for others at Stalingrad in 1943, for some not until the Allies crossed the Rhine in 1945, but it came for all of them eventually. The real question, the one that haunted many of them until their deaths, was what should they have done with that knowledge? Should they have staged a coup, assassinated Hitler, refused orders, sabotaged production, arranged a surrender? Or were they right to keep fighting, to follow discipline and orders even into the abyss, to let the political leadership make the political decisions while they just did their jobs? History has judged them harshly, and probably rightly so, because there comes a point when professional duty becomes complicity, when following orders becomes a crime, when doing your job means participating in catastrophe. They knew they'd lost, knew it long before the end, but they kept fighting anyway, and that knowledge without action, that seeing without acting, is perhaps the most damning thing about them. Not that they failed, but that they failed knowing they would fail and did it anyway, sacrificing hundreds of thousands of lives for a cause they knew was already dead. The snow had stopped falling by the time Keitel signed the surrender documents at Karlshorst in Berlin, the same man who'd spent 4 years nodding at Hitler's delusions now being forced to acknowledge reality by making his signature on a document that ended the Reich. Around Germany, in cities that were rubble and countryside cratered by bombs, in prisoner-of-war camps holding millions of Wehrmacht soldiers, the men who'd carried out the losing war were trying to understand what they'd done and why they'd done it. Some would spend years in Soviet camps, some would be hanged at Nuremberg, some would go home and try to forget, some would write memoirs justifying their actions or confessing their guilt. But they'd all learned the same lesson too late, that knowing you're going to lose isn't enough if you don't have the courage to act on that knowledge, that following orders isn't a virtue when the orders are evil or insane, that professional competence in service of moral bankruptcy is just another form of guilt. They'd known they'd lost the war long before it was over, but they'd fought on anyway, and that knowledge without action, that certainty without resistance, is what condemns them. Not their failure, but their complicity in continuing long after failure was certain, turning a catastrophe into an apocalypse because they couldn't bring themselves to stop the machine they'd helped build and spent years feeding with the lives of their men.